Hello, everyone. I am Scanova the Carnotaurus. I am tired. Very, very tired. This is a bit awkward to explain, but I feel like I might not have to in order for you all to get the point. For the past year or so, my channel has largely been devoid of significant content. In fact, a decent chunk of it has been just updating you guys on what was going on, rather than doing anything substantial. Part of that is because of responsibilities I have that mean when I'm free, I'd rather have time for me, you know? However, there's another side to it. I really think I'm just tired of dinosaur survival games. I know this may be a bombshell for some, and I would completely understand just because of how much my channel revolves around these kinds of games. Just take a look at my channel, and it'll tell you as much. 8 out of the 12 most viewed videos on my channel are dinosaur survival game related. Many of those governing hundreds of thousands of views, including one of the videos that, to this day, I'm the most proud of. The reason for this goes back a lot farther than you might expect. It begins around 15 years ago now, when the dinosaur gaming landscape was a very different place. Dinosaurs in gaming were comparatively rare after the hiatus of the Jurassic franchise, so you really didn't see anything coming out outside of the generic shooter like Turok or Jurassic the Hunted. And I had fun with those games, along with some other ones like older Jurassic Park titles, the Jurassic Park the game that came out around that time, other niche games, so on. There was one type of dinosaur game that was noticeably absent, that younger me desperately wanted, really badly. One where you, the player, are a dinosaur. My mind was absolutely on fire with the possibilities of what you could do in a video game as a dinosaur. It's you as a dinosaur. That's the coolest thing ever, right? Why is that not a thing? I specifically remember in the early 2010s playing on the Wii with Ice Age 3 and Night at the Museum 2. In these games, there were very specific segments where you played as Diego hunting the antelope and riding on the T-Rex in the museum destroying stuff. Despite these segments being really short in the game in general, probably only lasting around 5 minutes, maybe a bit longer for Night at the Museum 2, I could not stop playing these segments over and over and over again for hours. Playing as Diego hunting gave this thrill of simulating a predator's instincts that hasn't really been seen before, and I just ignored the fact that I was actually the human on top of the T-Rex, and just pretend I was a T-Rex stomping around and trying to eat the other characters, despite the game not letting me. Times were so much simpler back then, I tell you what. This thirst was only really quenched when I got my hands on Primal Carnage, a game that entirely revolved around playing as dinosaurs and doing combat against them or as them. And this would only continue. In late 2015, I bought The Isle on Steam. While a bit novel and not impressive at the slightest at the time, this game would spark an entire new generation in dinosaur gaming, one that would fully take advantage of the desire to become a remnant of the past. First it was The Isle, and then the Architect Project, then Saurian, then Dinosaurs, a prehistoric adventure, then Beast Bermuda, then The Beast of 9500, then Path of Titans, then Pangea Survival, then The Isles of Pangea, then Dinosaurs Prehistoric Survivors, then Sanctuary Island, then The Isles of Yore, then Dinosaurs of Prehistoric Adventure 2. Yeah. Over the past 5 years or so, there has been a serious oversaturation of these types of games, and, if I am to be honest, none of them are that good. Don't get me wrong, a vast majority of them are hardly memorable. There are a few that have stuck around to be possibly some of the most influential games I've played. The Isle connected me with a lot of my current friends and communities, and still remains the titan of the genre. Beast Bermuda was an underdog story that actually succeeded in a lot of its ambitions, and Path of Titans provided a potentially different perspective in how a dinosaur survival game can be played. Note how all of those were in the past tense. As much as I do like a lot of things about these games, over the past year, I can count the number of times I played any of these games on just one hand. This is because, now that the wonderment of playing as a dinosaur is well behind most of us, there are a series of factors that hold all these games back. Ironically, despite a lot of people saying that they're largely clones of each other, my problems with each of these games are completely different from one another. and this is what I'm going to cover today. Yes, this is going to basically be an opinion piece, and nothing really more, to be honest. In hopefully a more casual tone than I usually am, if you can't already tell. Hopefully all in one take as well. Let's find out. If you really can't get enough of these games even after all this time, then you do you. At the end of the day, I'm not going to argue that they're all awful games that you shouldn't play. This is just the bottom line on why I just can't play them anymore, really. In all honesty, considering I don't know if I'll ever make a dinosaur survival game video again after this one, I might as well lay out plain as day all of my frustrations with all these games. No bars held back, no discrimination, they're all getting it. To begin, let's do the game that started it all. The Isle is old. Really old. To say it a second time, in case it wasn't entirely comprehended the first, The Isle first released in December of 2015. The game's development has lasted long enough to where if a guy bought it when they came out at the end of high school, they could have a wife and child. 7 years is a very long time. And while The Isle has made a name for itself in that time, I'd argue that it hasn't seriously done too much. For its first 5 years or so, development went in circles. It released as an open-ended sandbox that kept adding experimental mechanics, then they removed that for the progression mode, which after being overhauled several times they gave up on for the survival mode, which lasted for a while. When it seemed like actual progress was being made, some bullshit controversy over the game's broken code erupted, the true details of which we'll probably never know, which meant the Isle was then on a massive hiatus. This left us with the past 2 years of Evirma, which has its own set of issues entirely. Evirma's Hope trailer was the break that the community was waiting for. The hype was enormous, and seemed definitely worth the wait for all that it showed. At first. Literally the day after a controversy that involved the developers bullying an Isle YouTuber for literally no reason, Evirma launched to a very poor reception. The game ran terribly, bugs galore, and there was really nothing more than a foundation, which was especially bad when the Hope trailer gave false impressions. After another bad controversy that I'm honestly surprised didn't kill the game entirely, we have Evirma's current progress. Evirma, as of writing this, has 5 major updates to its name over its 2+ years of development. Around 3 months after launch, there was Update 1. Update 1 added Dryosaurus, grazing, the first wave of AI, and quality of life changes. This update, while welcomed at the time, wasn't really received that well. Keep in mind that at this time, Evirma only had 3 dinosaurs you can play as, which was just a pathetic amount of content. As a result, after Evirma's launch, the player base dropped significantly in favor of Legacy, and Update 1 didn't change that. Update 2, on the other hand, was the push that made Evirma actually have a player base. Arriving 2 months after Update 1, this update added Bleeding, Carnotaurus, Stegosaurus, and Hypsilophodon. Personally, this update really rubbed me the wrong way. The developers were adamant on building the ecosystem from the ground up, starting with the smaller animals that provide important gameplay mechanics and then working up from there. In the face of this mindset, Update 2 really stands out. In my opinion, this was clearly a Hail Mary attempt to keep Evirma from dying. And in its defense, it did work. The game adds these 2 giant animals that, in the grand scheme of things, didn't really provide anything but balance problems. Carnotaurus, from what I've gathered, has had a history of just dominating the ecosystem for the most part, even if most resolves in the current patch as far as I know. While Stegosaurus is basically unstoppable. Not even Dinosuchus can touch them, despite being literally 3 times bigger and should just realistically drag them underwater. Speaking of Dinosuchus, Update 3 arrived 5 months after Update 2, bringing Pteranodon and Dinosuchus, providing flyer and semi-aquatic gameplay. This update was well received and did provide a meaningful foundation for future creatures. Update 4 came out over 7 months after Update 3, adding the Pachycephalosaurus along with the fracture and diet system. I hope you can see the elephant in the room with this update, but if not, you'll see in a moment. Update 5 came out 6 months after Update 4, adding skins and nesting. If you didn't catch it, Isle updates have been extremely slow, and have only been slowing down. Updates 2 and 3 are really the only updates in my opinion that have had understandable wait times. Aside from those two, the Isle has just left me and others pretty unimpressed. It's understandable that updates would take time and that's a lot of work. A delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is forever bad and all that. But it just seems like the content put out just isn't worth the wait for how long they've taken. If you were wondering why I gave an entire history segment to the Isle just now, it's because it shows just how much people have went through with this game, waiting for a game truly worth playing, and they're still waiting. The Isle has been steadily improving itself, but at what rate? Since I wanted to get back into the Isle, any issue I've had with the current game would usually be met with, just wait until the next update. This is a problem when updates at this rate are taking over half a year. Honestly, I'm just tired of waiting for anything substantial. This is also assuming that some unforeseen event doesn't completely derail the game, like it did in the past, or other problems I personally have. One of them is optimization. Update 5 in particular has received a bit of backlash due to seemingly tanking the game's performance, with the Isle just not cooperating for a lot of people's systems. Remember when I said I'd be back to the Isle after my last tier list video? I accidentally lied, because my PC literally couldn't load the game. It'd take up to 5 minutes just to see my character, and when I did load in, quote-unquote, the world itself would only half load, so I'd be in this weird Minecraft chunk not loading void. This lasted until Update 5, where the game still remains with poor frame rate and poor rendering for me, with the lack of polish just turning me off from playing because I know that it should be much better than this. Keep in mind that I can run Ark Survival Evolved comfortably at max settings. There's no reason that the Isle should be giving me a hard time. The Isle might have a history of just not maintaining optimization over time. I remember a point in the Legacy Isle where a solid third of the community couldn't play because it was just that demanding. Speaking of trends the Isle has, another is shitty developers. Remember how in Legacy the developers would behave outwardly horrible and toxic to their community, and because there was no other game like it, we just kind of took it and treated it like it was normal, providing the foundation for the toxic atmosphere the game's early years are known for? It was only when the Isle's player base became really big and more mainstream that people kinda stopped taking their shit. The pesky situation is probably the first serious community-wide backlash from what I can tell, and Jesus Christ, that paled in comparison to when they blindly defended a pedophile in their ranks and threatened those that wanted to warn them about it. It was so bad that the Isle's team basically went through an overhaul. They are in a much better state now, but they do still kind of have that attitude that they had before, where they'll act like they're in complete control at all times and will passive-aggressively belittle you for being anything of concern to them. Hello everyone, off-script scan here. If you really want an example of just how shitty the developers still are to this day, there's this one video that has been made by ShiftEV, who I highly recommend. He's another YouTuber that does dinosaur survival games. He displayed this very interesting conversation that happened in the Isle's Discord about a month ago, which just perfectly shows how awful their behavior still is. It just really goes to show that they really didn't learn a damn thing from the Paradigm incident, and are still just, the development team is still run by complete egomaniacs. It was this type of high and mighty behavior that did them in before. They act like they're in complete control and that you're a fool for questioning anything, and they'll always act that way to the very bitter end until they are completely done in. It's this right here that is the number one reason why I think the Isle will fail. They didn't learn a thing from what nearly did them in before, and considering this is the Isle we're talking about, I really bet on history repeating itself in some way, shape, or form. Alright, back to the main video. My final notes in the Isle is that I think there's a problem with how a lot of the dinosaurs are designed. My opinions have changed a fair bit from my tier list video, but I'm still adamant on design inconsistency being a problem. Also, given how almost no survival game has this, I think permadeath is going to end up being a problem in the future that keeps the Isle from being truly as great as it wants to be. But we'll see. With Beasts of Bermuda, I need to admit before anybody else that I am inherently biased with this game in particular. I've always preferred this game to the rest, and I've only had positive interactions with the developers, for a while being a moderator for the Discord and a game tester. However, I'm still going to lay out the issues that I have regardless, cause there's still a few. Beast of Bermuda is pretty unique because its updates are usually fairly frequent while also providing something new. Usually either new features or major tweaks to current ones, along with maybe a new creature or an overhauled creature. However, the structures of these updates can often leave holes in the balance of the game. When a new dinosaur is added, for example, there's bound to be balance problems, and the biggest ones are typically addressed pretty quickly. However, aside from those urgent fixes, they usually leave a lot of the other balance issues alone until the next content update. This could be a problem when there are certain issues that can just kill the desire to play as certain dinos, since whatever makes them inviolable won't be dealt with for a while, because it wasn't as game-breaking as the issues that they fixed. The main example I can think of is when Rex was added. While the things immediately broken about it were fixed, the Speed Rex build was really strong, and I remember it discouraging me from playing Para or Megalo at all because it meant either you went min-max speed or you just die on sight to them. There's never been a period of time in the game where everything has actually been balanced pretty well, so there's always something currently lackluster. When something becomes viable again, something else becomes pointless. Also, the game does have a lot of what I like to call developer band-aids, where a certain feature or quirk is added purely to fix a single balance issue, which makes the game feel a lot less seamless. The main examples are Stamina Drain on Agro's Roar, which exists purely to help it fight Rex, and the Wing Tear talent is less a talent option, and more something that Velo and Ori are required to spec into, because they have literally no defense against pterosaurs otherwise. Certain aspects of how the game is developed I also have a problem with. First is, fun fact, the developer of Utahraptor and Beast of Bermuda is in the hands of purely one guy. I hope you can see the problem with the development of an entire creature being slow because it's the favorite of one of the developers. Second, the sponsored dinos. This is something Path of Titans has an issue with too, but it's better observed here because of how farther along these creatures are development-wise. While it may seem like a good idea at the time to allow people to spend money to have something they like added to the game, I'd argue that it can stagnate the game in the long term. This is especially the case when the ideas or creatures brought in either don't add anything or aren't actually that good to begin with. This isn't always the case. Orthodromius is such a breath of fresh air to the game, but then there's ones like Coahuiloceratops, which is an omnivore that acted like a fairly giant slow brawler type, when 80% of the herbivores are giant fairly slow brawler types. I saw the opportunity for Coahuila to be kind of like a warthog, a small and fairly fast to fill in that role that herbivores lacked, while also maybe eating bones, because that's a niche nothing currently has, but the final version left a lot to be desired. I know that the sponsor's decisions need to be respected, since they did dedicate so much for a game's cause, but that's completely independent to the quality of what was added. Back to stagnation, the game is currently imbalanced in terms of playables, with herbivores really suffering compared to everything else. But they can't really fix that, because what the people paid for takes priority. Out of the 5 new dinosaurs added since release, 4 of those were sponsored creatures. Megaraptor was the only exception, and it wasn't even really planned. And with at least 3 more sponsored creatures on the way, it's going to be a really long time before things with composition get addressed. Finally, there's a serious problem with the game's community, in my opinion. Megapacks run rampant, with clans tending to dominate servers and local communities. This is something that can't exactly be fixed. The Isle had this issue too, but what isn't excusable is how the community can be so hell-bent on the game not developing along its course. The community has people so desperate to keep their extremely powerful 3.0 plus dinos at full power that they will actively backlash in force against any sort of progress. The amount of backlash towards actually good changes has been astronomical. It only takes looking at what happened to the Discord around the time of the updates to see how. It's a tale as old as time. People are complacent with overtuned stats and abilities, so at any form of resistance to these broken systems, they claim that they're now completely useless and entirely ruined. The easiest example is when Velociraptor rightfully got its nerf. Most prominent was its jumping, which didn't let it jump between islands anymore. Plenty claimed Velo is now a useless jumper, when it could still jump clear over an entire Apatosaurus. And God forbid anything with growth was rebalanced at all. It's been extremely frustrating to witness, and I'm glad to finally state my stance against this just kinda... it's bullshit. Path of the Titans is a game that I feel for me has been kind of a disappointment. Path of the Titans is a game that I hoped would achieve a lot of what I felt the other games lacked. When its demo was launched, it initially promised the demo phase, followed by pre-release and an official release. It seemed like a much more efficient plan than what anyone else was doing. However, skip forward to today, it's basically just early access, with the gameplay basically just Legacy Isle with a few differences here and there, most of which are not good. Like for example, Path of the Titans prides itself as an MMO, but it barely has the stuff to call itself one, and the parts that are present can be pretty painful. The perk system it has is actually pretty cool, in terms of the new abilities and passive perks you could obtain, but there's parts of the system that I feel are needlessly limiting. Diets are one thing. Unlike the other two games, where it's either an option to better your character, or is somewhat important to the gameplay loop, a lot of the diets in Path of Titans just limit you for no real reason. For example, the two omnivores, quote-unquote, in the game, Struthiomimus and Dinosaur, are usually entirely limited to either one or the other, depending on what they pick, which I feel kills the point in an omnivore to begin with. Another way the MMO mechanics limit the game is in how they handle combat. So you know how in a lot of MMO games you have all of your attacks and abilities on a hotbar, and once you use one it has a cooldown, so you need to use something else? Path of the Titans has that, but with none of the nuance. So it has one of the most infuriating fighting systems I've ever seen. A lot of the combat is often just both sides awkwardly staring at each other for their cooldowns to wear off, or it's painfully one-sided because the moves are so telegraphed you can basically ignore them, or you're getting stuck on each other through the funky collision. This in particular has stopped me from playing Path of the Titans casually. Balance in Path of the Titans is also really bizarre. The developers claim that the stats are placeholders, so it doesn't really matter, but they also randomly make changes and updates that make or break certain creatures. So what's the point? This is even worse when entirely new creatures are added. They're usually hyped up by the developers, but on release they're almost always gutted versions of themselves. And it's only in later updates that they actually got what they should have had on launch. On launch, Sarco's stats were gimped, and, without the lunge ability, it actually worked better as a terrestrial ambusher than as an aquatic. Anodontosaurus and Daspletosaurus were both not worth playing at all in their release, and only got bone break and armor later. For a recent example, the T-Rex has largely been considered a disappointment, because it's literally just better Despleto and nothing more. It's all hype and zero substance. Speaking of T-Rex, how was that most recent update, guys? I really enjoyed witnessing the backlash after an entire community felt lied to after the pre-rendered trailer that released that showed stuff that wasn't in the game, along with the poor reception of the update itself in general because of T-Rex connection issues and more. Want to know how the devs reacted? They basically just turned the Discord off until the majority of the hate was gone. They did something similar to this when they came out in support of crypto, which was not only a major display of their characters' developers, but also an entirely useless drama considering PayPal supports crypto anyway. Why did they need to do this and hurt themselves? Who knows. Also, just saying, regardless of what happens, I feel like the game will survive purely off its modding scene and being basically on every platform, no matter how flawed the foundation is. Again, we'll find out. To end on something a bit more positive, I actually really love the dinosaur designs. You can kind of tell that one of the head devs is a paleo artist. They just give off that vibe, and it's nice to see pleasing looking accurate dinosaurs. However, I do think there's one caveat to them. They are all extremely plain. They look like they belong, sure, but they also lack any oomph or style that makes them particularly memorable. With the Isle and Beasts of Bermuda, they're realistic but distinct. You can tell what games these are from. With Path of the Titans, they just feel like any other dinosaur reconstruction. Minor, I know, but I did want to put this out there. Now, I know this video has generally been negative, but I do need to express one more time that these games have formed a lot of who I am today. as well as my perspective on games as a whole. I wouldn't be me without them. I wouldn't be where I am now. And that's kinda scary. The future, you know. Again, the vast majority of you were here because of content like this, and I obviously feel a little guilty about leaving it behind. I hope the regulars have enough faith to stay with me, and that those that love the older content can still think of it fondly. And with that, I think this chapter on my channel has come to a close. This has been Skinova the Carnotaurus, and I'll see you next time. Oh, one more thing. This will be a bit of a channel PSA, really. Don't compare me to Pesky. Please. Please. Don't compare me to Pesky. This isn't for any petty reasons, or because it's annoying, because it really isn't. I always thought the comparisons were pretty cool and funny, even offered to collab with him in the past. However, all of that is kind of soiled when the man is literally and unironically transphobic. Yeah, not a lot of people know this about him, but it's really shitty. Also makes me really, and I mean really uncomfortable, knowing that this has basically been a known thing for months, but from what I can tell has just kind of been ignored. I'm just laying down the final line, because it does, and I'm being completely serious when I say this, make me very uncomfortable to be compared to him, considering it's that kind of attitude that seriously hurts people, and it hits close to home for me personally. Alright, that's it. Video over.